Okay, welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to cover 3D layers, lights, and cameras, and how to cast shadows and things like that in After Effects. And we are going to be looking at also their new Draft 3D interface that allows you to do real-time or closer to real-time previews of things. It uses OpenGL, I believe, or Metal, whatever. It uses the GPU to render these things, but it turns off shadows and some other things that take time to calculate. So you get a preview that works pretty well, but you don't have the shadows. So in this current scene, on this frame, right, this is with the lights, the shadows, everything set up as it should be. And granted, the light's a little low in here, but I'm trying to keep the number of lights and things to a minimum, just as a means of making this simple. If I go ahead and play through this, right, you can see as I'm previewing this, it's taking a long time to generate each frame. And so, but you can see the shadows being cast from this fish across the landscape that's behind it. And you'll also notice the camera is moving towards the objects, right? Instead of having to zoom all the objects towards the viewer, right? What I can do is I can basically dolly the camera in as though it's a real camera. So if I go ahead and stop that and I click on Draft 3D and come back, right, you'll see that, right, it plays back at real time. And you'll notice there's some weird artifacting here, and there's no shadows. But it does play back in real time. It gives us a much better preview than you previously could get. And one of the other nice features is that you get what's called a work plane, right? This grid that's here tells you where the floor is, right? And so you can, it's really helpful for alignment of your different assets. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to start this from scratch, and we'll import a couple assets and get going. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating a new composition. And apparently that will take a second. Let's just go ahead and call this like 3D layers example or something like that. And we can just leave it set at the default settings. It's 1920 by 1080. I have it set to this medium gray blue. Whatever color you've got there is fine. The resolution, I currently have it set to 1/3 just so that my computer runs quick enough. You could, if you're not doing multiple things, you could probably go full or half or whatever. But I'm just going to hit OK. That's something we can always change here. Okay, so we've got our composition. So we're going to need to import some assets. So I'm going to go ahead and step back a couple steps. Okay, so I've got this footage folder. Now, one of the issues is that what I don't want to have happen is I don't know why these are grayed out. I think there's just a problem there. Yeah, because now they're not grayed out. I don't know. But so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and for these PSD files in particular, we are going to import these as compositions, and we want to retain layer sizes, right? So what that does is it keeps the boundaries around the outside of our individual layers. And then we might as well, this one, I don't think we're going to break out, but we'll go ahead and do composition retain layer sizes for this. We're going to hit OK, and then we're going to come back in and grab that creased, crinkled, crumpled paper. So I'm going to import those. Now what that does is it means that I have the layers for these different objects, which is what I'm going to be using some of, right? It's a few more assets than we need, but we're just going to be pulling a couple in. And then let's go ahead and get that crinkle crumple paper. So I'm going to pop this back up. I'm going to grab that one and just hit open because we're just going to import that as footage. Okay. So now let's go ahead and throw some of these in here. We're going to start with some of the objects that we'll be using. So I'm just going to grab, in the fishes one, I'm going to grab the layer 1 fishes, layer 2 fishes, pull these down into my composition. All right, they're just sort of in the center right now and overlapped. I'm going to zoom out a bit, and I am going to deselect these and just select these one at a time. And and move them. I'm going to go ahead and, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and leave these here, but I just want to get things spread out so they're not directly on top of each other. So then we can go ahead and we're going to do this crumpled paper. We're going to do the composition because then it just has all the layers involved. And I'm going to put that at the very top so that it should go, oops, sorry, I meant the very bottom. So it goes behind this so I can still see my other assets. And then with the marine invertebrates layers, we're just going to take layer 1, layer 2. So if I hold down Shift, I can select layer 2. And then if I hold down Command on the Mac or Control on Windows and click on layer 5, then I can just select those 3 because those are the only 3 objects we're going to use. And there I can drag these out. I'll put those on top so that they're all visible. Oh, apparently I had caps lock on. I don't know when that happened, but oops. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and spread these out a little bit as well, just so I have these 3 objects up here. And then what else do we need? The last thing we're going to need is going to be our ground plane, and we'll bring that in just a second. Okay, so to start with, in order for any 3D action to happen, what we need to do is we need to make our layers 3D layers. And so if I come into my composition and I select the first one, I hold down Shift, select the last one, and I go over to this little cube and I just click and drag down here, then it's going to turn all of these into 3D layers, which is pretty simple and pretty great. And you'll notice that it has changed it's given us this weird handle, right? If you've worked with 3D software before, this should be familiar, right? Because in 3D space, this green arrow is the Y direction, which is up and down. The red arrow is the X direction, which you'll notice it, if you hover over the end there, it puts a little X or a Y or a Z. And the red arrow is the X direction, which is left and right. And then the Z direction is forward and backward towards and away from the camera or the viewer. And then you'll also notice there's these rings here. So this thing has the ability to both, if I click on the arrowheads, I can, and I have everything selected. Let me just select one object. If I click on the arrow, like the green arrowhead, right, I can move this up and down. If I click on the red arrowhead, I can move it right and left. If I click on one of these rotation things, which there is a Y rotation and an X rotation here, it's hard to see. But if I click on the Z, that's the most obvious. I can turn this fish sideways, which is what I want. But I can, and if I was actually to hold down Shift while I did that, it should snap to 90 degrees, which is where I wanted it to be. If I hover over the Y dot here, right, it's on top of this thing, I can start to rotate this, and you'll see because everything's at the same level, half the fish disappears because it's rotating behind the other assets, right? So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. So everything is in the same plane right now. Now, what's happening currently is we're using the standard 3D renderer that has been in here forever, and so if we had lights and stuff, it would be working. What we're going to do is we're going to turn on Draft 3D, because then there's these 3 options up here that are normally grayed out that allow us to move the camera in 3D space. And we can do that in this view as well, but we're not going to have the ground plane or anything. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn on Draft 3D, and you'll see that when I do that, certain things have disappeared, and that's totally fine. And that's because they're all sharing the same exact space, except for this object for some reason. But and then there's this little grid over here. If it's in black and white, make it green. I'm going to select this big layer by just clicking off in black space somewhere. And now what I can do is if I come up here, I have these 3 controls. So I have rotate or orbit. I have pan, which allows me to move the entire scene up, down, left, right. And dolly means the camera's coming towards or away from the scene. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on orbit, and I'm going to rotate this. And as soon as I start to rotate that view, you'll see that it's all a total disaster, right? These things are all intersecting with one another. And so we need to adjust some things in space. I'm actually going to turn Draft 3D off for a second so I can see my assets better. I'm going to hit the letter V to use my selection tool, or I can click on that arrow up there. And I'm going to go ahead and deselect the big thing, right? Because if I have this selected and I try and select other things, nothing happens. And actually, why don't I just go ahead and push this back in space? I'm clicking on the Z direction, and I'm just going to start by moving this back in 3D space. All right, so now that I've done that, I should be able to, I'm going to pull some of these guys forward. Oops. If I can find the arrowhead, and if I can't, I can rotate my view. I think I'm going to need to, oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to pull him forward just a little bit. And really, right, I just want these objects to, there's my Z, there we go. To just be forward a little bit from where they were previously. Okay, so now I'm going to turn Draft 3D on, so things should no longer intersect. And I'm going to go ahead and click on Orbit, and I'm going to start rotating my view. Now I want you to note that, right, currently the ground plane, and maybe what I'll do is I'll zoom in some, so I'll fit this. Okay, so currently the ground plane is about halfway through all of my objects, right? And that's because in this space, the origin where these two heavy black lines meet, which is behind this fish right now, is 0, 0, 0, right? That's where, when you're at the origin in 3D space, all the directions you're at 0 pixels away from that origin space. So each one of these is a little bit in different space. So let's go ahead. I'm going to hit the letter V, and I'm just going to go ahead and start moving these assets. I want these to basically, you know, be against the floor. I'm not doing too much alignment right now, other than to just lift these guys up a little bit, and it looks like I have a third one down here. Let's go ahead and pull that up a little bit higher in the scene. I'm going to rotate my other fish, and so I'm just going to hover over that Z direction so I get that circle, and I'll rotate that about 90 degrees. It doesn't really matter if it's perfect or not. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull this one up a little bit, and now I'm going to go back to my orbit. Now, the other thing is, if you hover over these, you'll see that you get what the quick keys are at the very end of the text that pops up. So the quick key is 1, 2, and 3. So if I hit the number 1, now I have this ability to orbit my scene again. And so you can kind of see how this is working. And I'm going to say this fish is still a little too low because I think it's still intersecting the ground plane, or it's close to, but we're going to find out really quick. And so I'm going to rotate this view a touch more. And then if I hit 2, I can pan, right? So I can pull the camera around. And this might be a good view, but what I really want is when I put my ground plane in, I want that to be able to see the shadows cast on there. So I'm still like kind of working on this, but this is kind of the angle that I want this to be at. But what's nice is that, and then this, if I hit 3 and I use my mouse side to side, I can dolly in or dolly out from the scene. Okay, so let's add our last asset. Our last asset is going to be the creased crumpled paper. It's basically white paper. I'm going to go ahead, and if I drop this down here, I can't see it at all, right? Let's go ahead and make it so it blocks everything to start with. Right, so I'm going to put it on this top layer, and I'm going to go ahead and I need to make it a 3D layer. So I'm going to make it a 3D layer. As soon as I do that, it pops the center of that back to the origin. And now that it's in the origin, I'm going to use the V key, right, or my selection tool, so I can access this rotation. And I'm going to rotate this plane. I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees so it's in line with the ground plane in our scene. And you'll see this fish is indeed still too low, so I'm going to pull him up so he might be a bottom feeder, but he's not going to be too close to the bottom. Okay, so let's go ahead and dolly out a little bit. So I'm going to hit the number 3. I'm going to dolly my scene out just a touch so I have a bit more stuff going on in here. And then what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to scale up the at least the green object here. So I'm going to hit the letter V. I'm I'm going to select this, and I can still use these handles to scale it, or I can come in here and grab this object, flip open here, go to my transform, and increase the scale some so it fills the page. And I'm going to try not, basically this will be as far from the scene as my camera is, and I'm going to bring it in closer. So as long as it fits that, I'm good. I'm going to select this ground layer. There we go. See, I was still on this one, so just be careful. So I'm going to select this, and now I'm going to go ahead and hit S so I can open up the scale. I'm going to drag that out so it scales up out to the sides a little bit. And it looks like it's growing towards the camera, but it's not. Or it's not moving up and down. It just gives that appearance because of the scale. So now I won't have any edges visible from my view. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to deselect both of those. I need to select my fish. And I'm actually going to pull this fish much closer to the camera. And I'm going to bring it up a little bit. I'm going to leave this one down here. And let's go ahead and we'll start by animating the motion of this fish. Right? We want it to start off screen and basically just swim across. And I did it in 15 seconds or so. So let's go ahead and take our work area and just shrink it down somewhere below 30 seconds. And so now what I need to do is I need to keyframe this motion. But first, let's get it set where we want it. So I'm pulling the Y direction because it's been rotated a little bit. And I'm going to have to use my mouse wheel to zoom out on my thing. You can also change this to 25% or whatever it takes. And I'm just going to pull this off screen entirely. And then what we're going to do is, this is the layer we're currently working on. I'm going to hit P for position, and you'll see, this is something I haven't talked about, but you'll see that I actually have 3 axes of position now, right? I have X, Y, and Z. And so if I adjust this, you'll see that, actually, sorry, and this is global, it's not local, right? Local is, the fish is oriented off, but it's still doing it. So which one? Here we go. Okay, so this first value is the one that I'm going to want to keyframe. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my keyframes on for position. That's my first keyframe. I'm going to move my cursor, hold down Shift and snap it to the end of my composition. I'm going to click on this. I'm just going to drag the fish all the way across until it's out of the scene. Right? And so now, because I'm using this fast preview, I can go ahead and play this and it'll play back in real time, which is pretty awesome. And I know my screen is still zoomed in some, right? So the fish is going across. It's not a very fast fish. It's moving, pretty slowly, but it's going across the scene. Now we could speed this up a little bit, but that should be fine for this tutorial. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out. So I've got that animation done. Now one of the issues is that there's the lights and everything become problematic when we're doing we're doing the draft 3D mode. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my fish into the scene here a little bit because I want there to be basically a spotlight that the fish moves in front of that's going to be shining on these objects down here. Okay, so how do we create a light? To create a light, we go up and we go to Layer, New, and Layer, New, and Light. And to start with, it by default, it wants you to choose an ambient light. An ambient light basically just provides a colored light that's just even across the entire scene. We're going to create an ambient light, but first let's create a spotlight because I want to show you what that looks like. These are the settings mine is currently set at. I don't know if there's a way I can just reset it to the defaults. Make sure cast shadows is turned on. I have the shadow darkness set to 200%. I'm going to set that back. I think it's 60 is what and 60, I don't know what the angles are, what the cone feather. We're going to leave everything else the same. The radius is I think the radius is usually like 500 to start with. So I've got all of this set. I'm going to hit OK. And as soon as I do that, the scene gets very, very dark, right? Because what it's done is it said, oh, well, you're using a light. Now we need to have this thing. And so part of it is like, well, why is it so dark? What happened? The first thing I need to do is I'm going to need to roll in a little bit. And then I'm going to need to rotate my view. So I'm going to go ahead and go to 1, which is orbit. I'm going to rotate this around, and I want you to notice first that the light is actually behind the fish, but it should be shining on these other objects, right? So the first thing I want to do is I want to pull the light out so it's in front of the fish. So I'm going to use the V to pull this back, pull this up. And my goal now is to see if I can get this to illuminate that fish. So I'm going to hit number 1 so I can orbit my view again. Whoa. I'm going to click on the fish. Okay, so you can see it's starting to illuminate the tail a little bit. So there's a couple things we can do to help this out. And there's a couple reasons why it's so dark. So first, if I double click on the light in my composition, I get my light settings that pop back up. I can also set these with the flip down, but it's a lot easier to do it here. So first, let's change our light color to something brighter and happier. And hit OK. And then let's make the intensity 100%. That automatically brightened it up a lot. The other thing is this fall off. So if we say none, what that means is that the light is going to basically not have any, it's not going to get more dim as it gets further from the light source, right? Fall off basically says the light gets weaker as it gets further from the source. Now, in some cases, this might be the way you want to go. In our case, we're just going to do the inverse square clamped, which is physically accurate. And what that means is you just need to increase that radius. So if I increase my radius here, right, this is going to brighten up. And if I get it really bright, you'll see that it's going to start casting light in the entire scene, right? But it creates something that's like much moodier and more natural feeling if we do it this way. And we're going to leave the shadow darkness at 60% for now. The cone feather is basically, is it a hard, crisp edge or a soft edge? And so right now the cone feather is 50%. If I drop this down to 0, you'll see that I get this nice crisp edge, or actually I'm at like 3%, which is probably a more accurate, like soft but hard edge of a spotlight. To make it very obvious when the light's on and off, we'll go ahead and leave that. I am going to lift, and I'm going to leave everything else the same. The only other thing we can do is if we adjust the cone angle, right? That's determining how wide or how narrow this spotlight is, right? So maybe we can go ahead and have the cone angle. I mean, I had it at like 53 degrees, but yeah, or somewhere around 50 degrees is okay. And this is at 1979, at least for where the light is currently. I'm going to hit OK. Now that I've done that, I'm going to hit the letter V. So I can adjust this. I want the light to be a little bit higher because I want to be able to rotate it along the X direction. Oops. Oh, right. So if I do this, I'm going to get an error, but it just says it moves towards its point of interest, which is what this is right here. And I think if I use the pan behind tool, I can grab that point of interest. Yeah, you can see that I can move this around using that point of interest, which we're not going to worry about the point of interest too much for this tutorial. Okay, so I've got this lit up so that it's actually shadowing on the ground. And so now that I've got a light in the scene, you can see that, but you can see it's not casting any shadows. If I turn Draft 3D off, right, now it's hard to see because there's not much light in here at all, but there are shadows being cast. If I use the orbit tool and orbit my view a little bit, I should be getting a shadow cast on something from this fish. Oh, right, there's one thing I totally forgot about. Okay, so I'm still not getting shadows. So why on earth am I not getting shadows on this thing? I'm going to go ahead and increase the cone angle a little bit on the light first, just because then we'll get potentially more shadows and more light in the scene. And the intensity can go over 100% as well if we want it to, but I'm going to leave it there for the time being. I am going to set my shadow darkness to 100% though. Okay, so why am I not getting shadows, right? I have the light turned on to cast shadows. The issue is each of these layers needs to be able to cast shadows as well and accept shadows. So if I open up if I flip one of these up and down, you'll see that there's all the transform tools, but now there's also this material options. If I flip open my material options, you'll see cast shadows is turned off. There's also light transmission, so these layers can be somewhat transparent, and the color of their shape can be cast on other things, which is pretty cool. But you'll see accept shadows is on and accept lights is on, but cast shadows is off. So what I'm going to do is I am going to select all of these layers except the spotlight, which actually I'm just going to go ahead and move that all the way down so I can select all these layers at once, because I want these all to be able to cast shadows and accept shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and, with them all selected, if I flip this open and flip this open and change this to on, then all of these objects will start casting shadows. You may have noticed that immediately as soon as that changed. And now if I go ahead and use orbit to orbit my view a little bit, you can see that there are shadows being cast on the other objects from this fish that's blocking the view, which is pretty great. Okay, so the scene's really, really dark, especially where the shadows are, because we only have one light, right? The only source of light in this entire dark space is this one. So let's go ahead and close these all up, and let's create a second light. So we're going to say layer, new, light. And we are going to, this time we're going to create an ambient light just to fill in everything. So I'm just going to say ambient. And in this case, I'm going to make it a little bit murkier, right? This is an underwater scene, so I'm going to say OK for that color. The intensity is 100. Notice none of these other settings are there. I'm just going to hit OK and see how much light. Ooh, that is too much light. So let's go ahead and open this up and let's drop this intensity down to like 30%. Okay, so maybe 30 is a little low. Let's go up to 50. Okay, so now I can see some of the detail where it's not in shadow. And I still have the orbit set. So again, I'm going to go ahead and reset my scene. And I'm going to bring this back to frame 0, so my fish is totally off screen. And okay, so there's its mouth coming in right there. So we're going to leave this set like this. These objects are all very close to one another and scaled very similarly. You could move these around or do whatever you want to with them. For this tutorial, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so I've got that light set. And I could make this spotlight, I can't remember what our intensity is it at 100? Let's make the spotlight intensity 120%. So it's just like a little bit brighter. Okay, so we've got this set, and if I'm not in draft 3D mode, right, and I'm trying to play this preview, right, it's actually not, so it started going all right. And then it slowed down substantially, but you can see, right, the shadow being cast across this entire thing, and and then the fish moving out of that spotlight, and right, the shadows being lifted as it goes back into shadow over here on the side of the screen. But again, it's moving very, very slowly. Okay, so what do we need to do now? So let's go ahead and introduce cameras. So currently, you'll notice that there's this active camera, one view, and if I click on active camera, there's a whole bunch of options down here. So really, the active camera currently is our default camera, right? Which is just the camera that is generated for us to view this scene through. Now, we don't often, at least up until this point in After Effects, we haven't thought of the camera as an object, but the camera is an object. You can think of it like a physical camera that's in physical space, especially in this 3D, when you're working with 3D. The camera is in physical space aimed at a particular object. And so let's go ahead. But so there's also the front, left, top, back, right cameras. And there's this one view. If you want to work with, say, 4 views, right, this is the top view of the scene, which you can't see any objects because they're, right, these lines. This is the default active camera. This is my right view, and this is my front view, which is like a little bit too close, but right, so you can see the objects now, and you can only see where they are, right, within this view plane, but I can see the objects, and oftentimes this helps for aligning things. You know, having all 4 views can sometimes be pretty useful, but we're going to go back to one view, and let's go ahead and create a camera. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Camera, and it's going to give me a whole bunch of settings here. We're going to leave everything set basically to the defaults. It's a 2-node camera. If I switch it to a 1-node camera, I honestly don't know what the difference is. I'd have to look it up. I can enable depth of field. So if I turn this on, what that means is that, right, it gives us our focal length, we have our film size, all of these things are going to change like the angle of view, and we'll look at these settings in real time in the viewport, right? But basically the focal length at 50 millimeters is like a standard lens size, right? There's telephoto lenses or longer lenses have higher numbers in the 300s. If you go down to like 15 or 10 millimeters, that's what's called a fisheye lens. So you actually will get that distortion in this. The depth of field is going to basically means that there will be blurring that will happen. I can adjust my f-stop, I can adjust my aperture, and I can adjust the blur level. And so what that means is that the scene will be blurry if the center of the camera's focal point is not right, if it's not within that zone of focus. And we're just going to call this camera 1. We're going to leave it at that 50 millimeter preset, and we're going to hit OK. Now, as soon as I do that, right, my current active camera is camera 1, right? That's why my view is so different. So now I can use the pan or the orbit pan and dolly tools to set the position of this camera, right? So if I want this to be, the fish to be as close as possible and totally block up the whole scene, which I think is what's going to happen here, I can do that. The other thing is I need to find where the focus is and where the depth of field is at. So if I open up my camera down here in my composition, I can double click on this as well and bring up these settings, but I want to show you the settings here as well. There's all these camera options, and there's, right, my zoom, my depth of field, my focus distance, my aperture, blur level, iris shape, etc., 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 right? There's a lot of different things that you can set and keyframe, and it's all in pixels here. If you want it to be, if you want to use it more like a traditional camera, you just double click there. You can come up and you can say, okay, I want my focal length to be, if I set that, let's just go ahead and set this to 15 and hit OK. And you'll see what that does is it does the fisheye thing, right? There's a lot of distortion here. It actually looks like the camera's further away from the scene than it was originally. I do also want you to note all of this is blurred because I have that depth of field set. I'm going to go ahead and pull out of there a little bit. But those are blurred for that reason. Let's go ahead and we can go ahead and set that just back to 50. Just keep it where it's supposed to be. But let's go ahead and it's our focus distance. It's funny that these are in millimeters. It drives me a little bit crazy. But if let's go ahead and cancel that. And let's come down here and adjust our focus distance. Let's make our focus distance 100. right? If I do that, I don't see anything. And that's because the blur is so intense that I'm missing it all. So let's make it 1,000. Now everything is out of focus, but it's getting closer. If I continue to adjust this, right, if I make this smaller, you'll see everything's getting blurrier and blurrier. If I make the value bigger, it's going to get crisper and crisper until it's about the distance the camera is from the scene. And if I go too far, we should also get, although I probably have to go really too far, it should blur again, right? But it's, it's not doing that. So let's go ahead and get this so it's just barely there. And so what should happen now is if the fish moves in front of the lens, you can see it's a little bit sharper in focus than the objects behind it. Now we could adjust our depth of field by adjusting our aperture. If I make this 0, if I make it bigger, there we go. Yeah, if I make the aperture larger in size, then the depth of field gets more shallow. So if I want this to, have, there we go, a little bit more focus on that, I can pull the fish out of the way. You can see the background is blurred, the fish is in focus. I could push this thing a little bit further away if I wanted to, but there we go, right? So we've got lights, we've got a camera, and so let's keyframe some of the camera attributes so we can zoom in. So first, I want to dolly away from the scene a little bit. So I want to pull this back to about here. And you can see that everything's getting blurrier because, right, my focal length is, I haven't adjusted where the camera is focused. I'm going to hit the number 2 so I can pull this over a little bit like this, and maybe 1 so I can rotate my camera just a touch. There we go. Let's do, ooh, that's almost too far out. Let's go ahead and pan this way just a hair. Okay, so this is where I want my camera to start. So what do I set in order to be able to keyframe this motion? So what I need to do is I need to go to my transform, and if I go ahead and use one of these tools like the pan, you'll see that it's changing my point of interest and my position values. Those are the ones that are being modified. If I use the dolly, right, it's again modifying both of those. So those are the things that I want to be focused on when I'm keyframing camera movements. Now there is orientation and X and Y and Z rotation and all of that as well. But if you want to use these tools to set your camera position, this is the way to do it. If you want to have your camera spin in or something like that, then your X, Y, and Z rotation or your orientation would be a way to do that. So let's go ahead and set, we're on frame 0, I think. Yep. Let's go ahead and set our keyframes for both of those values. And all we're going to do with this is we're going to, we'll set those, let's go to our final frame. I'm going to snap over there. And what I want to do is I want to dolly in. You'll see it automatically creates keyframes. So I'm going to dolly into here. And while we're at it, why don't we do a little bit of an orbit as well? So I'm going to go ahead and change to the orbit tool, and I'm going to orbit to here. And I have no idea what that's going to look like. Now, the annoying thing with 3D stuff is that if I then go ahead and try and play this, it's going to go achingly slow. So this is a point where I'm going to turn on Draft 3D, and when I do that, you'll note that I don't get the blur, I don't get any, like all of those extra things are taken away. However, that does mean that I can get an accurate representation of how this camera is moving through this scene. Okay. and then it repeats. So I have got my scene ready to export. So I'm going to go ahead and save it now. This is a perfect time to save. And oh, and it says it's untitled. I'm going to go ahead and call this okay. So I've saved it, and you're good to go to render. I'll cover that in just a second.